Hello children. Today I'm going to read you one of my favourite stories. This story is called Duggar and it's by an author called Shirley Hughes. Once there was a soft brown toy called Duggar, and one of his ears pointed upwards and the other one flopped over, and his fur was worn in places because he was quite old and he belonged to Dave. Can you see him? There he is. Have you got a favourite toy? Dave was very fond of Duggar and he took him everywhere. Sometimes he gave him rides in a trolley, and sometimes he pulled him along on a lead made of string, just like a real dog. And when it was cold, he wrapped him up in a bit of blanket. Now and again, Dave's mum said that Duggar was getting much too dirty, and she showed Dave how to wash him in a bowl of soapy water, and then they hung him up by his tail on the washing line to dry. Does your favourite toy ever get dirty? Dave's baby brother Joe liked hard toys. He liked putting them in his mouth and biting on them because he was getting teeth. And Dave's big sister Bella, well, she took 7 teddies to bed with her every night. And she had to sleep right up against the wall to stop herself from falling out. Can you see Bella? There she is. And there's the 7 teddies. But Dave only liked Duggar. One afternoon, Dave and Mum set out to collect Bella from school. Mum took Joe in the pushchair and Dave took Duggar. And next to the school gate where the mums waited was a playing field, and some men with ladders were putting up coloured flags. Mum said there was going to be a summer fair to get money to buy things for the school. Dave pushed Duggar up against the railings to show him what was going on. Just then, the children started to come out of school, and an ice cream van came round the corner playing a tune. Bella ran up with her satchel flying. "Mum, can we have an ice cream?" And Mum gave her the money for 2 cones. Joe didn't have a whole ice cream to himself because he was too dribbly. On the way home, Dave walked beside the pushchair, giving Joe licks off his ice cream, and Joe kicked his feet about and shouted for more in between licks. At tea time, Dave was rather quiet, and in the bath he was even quieter, and at bedtime he said, "I want Duggar." But Duggar was nowhere to be found. Mum looked under the bed, and she looked behind the cupboard, and she searched in the kitchen and underneath the stairs. And Dave watched anxiously through the banisters, and Joe watched through the bars of his cot. Bella joined in to look for Duggar. She turned out her own toy box in case he was in there, but he wasn't. And when Dad came home, he looked for Duggar too. And he searched in the shed and down the garden path with a torch. But Duggar was quite lost. Dave was very sad when he went to bed, and Bella kindly lent him one of her teddies to go to sleep with, but it just wasn't the same thing as Duggar, and Dave kept waking up in the night and missing him. The next day was Saturday, and they all went to the school summer fair. The playing field was full of stalls and sideshows. And there was a fancy dress parade. Then there were sports with an egg and spoon race and a wheelbarrow race and a father's race. Bella was very good at races. She won the three-legged race with her friend Barbara. "Wouldn't you like to go in for a race?" they asked Dave. But Dave didn't feel like racing too much because he was missing Duggar. Then another exciting thing happened to Bella. She won the first prize in a raffle, and it was a huge yellow teddy. And it had a beautiful silk bow, and the teddy was almost as big as Dave. But Dave did not like that teddy at all. At that moment, he didn't like Bella very much either because she kept on winning things. And he went off on his own to look at the stalls. Now, one lady had a toy stall, and it was full of knitted ducks and cars and baby dolls. And there, at the very back of the stall, behind a lot of other toys, guess what was there? Duggar. And he was wearing a ticket saying 5p. Well, there were a lot of people around the stall, and Dave tried to explain to the lady that it was his Duggar. His Duggar who had got lost and somehow been put on the stall by mistake. But she wasn't listening, and he looked in his pocket. He had 3p, but it wasn't enough. He ran to find Mum and Dad to ask them to buy Duggar back at once. Dave went everywhere in the crowd, but he couldn't see Mum and Dad. He thought he was going to cry. At last he found Bella by the cakes, and when she heard about Duggar, she and Dave ran back to the toy store as fast as they could. But something terrible had just happened. Duggar had been bought by a little girl, and she was already walking off with him. Dave began to cry, and Bella ran after her and tried to explain that Duggar really belonged to Dave, and could she please buy him back. But the little girl said no. And she said that she'd bought Duggar with her own money and she wanted him. And she held on to him very tightly. Dave cried and cried. and the little girl started to cry too. But out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Bella's big yellow teddy. And she stopped crying, and she put out her hand to stroke his beautiful silk bow. And then Bella did something very kind. "Would you swap this teddy for my brother's dog then?" she asked. And right away, the little girl began to stop crying and smiled. And she held Duggar out to Dave and took the big teddy instead and went off with him in her arms. And then Dave smiled too, and he hugged Duggar and he hugged Bella round the waist. "Thank you, Bella," he said. And that night, Dave had Duggar in bed beside him, and Bella was practising somersaults. "Shall you miss that big teddy?" Dave asked her. "No," said Bella. "I didn't really like him. He was too big and his eyes were too staring. Anyway, if I had another teddy in my bed, there wouldn't be room for me.